The rough fabric bit into Sienna Nash's fingertips as she scrubbed another man's shirt against the washboard. Her knuckles already raw and bleeding from the lye soap that kept the boarding house laundry marginally clean in this dusty corner of Portland, Oregon in 1878. She wore the same patched dress she had worn for 3 years, the faded calico so mended and re-mended that it was hard to tell what the original color had been, though she thought it might have been blue once, back when her mother was still alive and they had a small cabin outside of town before the fever took everything. The boarding house owner, Mrs. Talbot, was a hard woman with a harder heart, and she paid Sienna barely enough to keep a corner of the attic and 1 meal a day, which meant Sienna went to bed hungry most nights and woke before dawn to start the fires. She was 20 years old and had never known anything but work and want. Her childhood cut short when she was 12, and her father died in a logging accident, leaving her and her mother to fend for themselves until the fever came 4 years later. Since then, Sienna had moved from one desperate situation to another, always hungry, always cold, always wearing clothes that were more patch than original fabric. She wrung out the shirt with hands that trembled from exhaustion and hung it on the line that stretched across the backyard, where chickens scratched in the dirt and a thin cat watched her with suspicious eyes. The autumn air held a bite that promised winter was coming, and Sienna already dreaded it because her dress had holes that let the wind through and she had no coat. She had tried to save money for fabric, but Mrs. Talbot always found reasons to dock her pay, claiming Sienna had broken a dish or hadn't scrubbed a floor properly. And so the coins Sienna managed to earn disappeared before she could accumulate enough for anything. It was on one of these raw October mornings that Sienna heard Mrs. Talbot talking to a man in the kitchen, her voice taking on the sugary tone she used when she wanted something. Sienna was supposed to be upstairs making beds, but she paused at the top of the stairs when she heard Mrs. Talbot say her name. "Sienna is a hard worker, Mr. Striker, and she would be grateful for any opportunity you might offer her," Mrs. Talbot was saying, and Sienna's stomach clenched because she knew that tone. Mrs. Talbot had tried to marry her off before to men who made Sienna's skin crawl, men who looked at her like she was a piece of meat they were considering purchasing. The man's voice was deep and gravelly, like rocks tumbling down a mountainside. "I am not looking for a wife, Mrs. Talbot. I am looking for someone who can sew." "Oh, Sienna can sew," Mrs. Talbot said quickly, though this was a lie. Sienna could manage basic mending, the kind that kept her own dress from falling apart completely, but she was no seamstress. "She is very skilled with a needle." "I need someone who can sew buckskin and leather," the man said. "I have hides that need to be made into clothing, and the woman who used to do it for me moved to California with her husband." Sienna crept down the stairs, curiosity getting the better of her caution. Through the doorway to the kitchen, she could see Mrs. Talbot's back and beyond her, a man who took up most of the space in the room. He was enormous, with shoulders so broad they seemed to brush the doorframe on either side, and arms thick with muscle that showed even through his buckskin shirt. His hair was dark and hung past his collar, tied back with a leather thong, and his face was tanned and weathered from years in the sun and wind. He had a beard neatly trimmed and eyes that were a startling shade of blue-gray, like a winter sky just before a storm. Sienna had never seen a man like him. The men in Portland were either merchants with soft hands and softer bellies, or loggers and dock workers, who were strong but had a mean edge to them from too much whiskey and too little hope. This man looked like he belonged in the mountains, like he had been carved from granite and pine, and there was something in the way he held himself that spoke of confidence and competence. "Let me fetch her, Mrs. Talbot said, turning toward the door, and Sienna barely had time to step back before Mrs. Talbot was calling her name. "Sienna, come down here this instant." Sienna smoothed her patched dress as best she could and walked into the kitchen, keeping her eyes lowered because that was what Mrs. Talbot expected. But she could feel the man's gaze on her, measuring and assessing, and when she dared to glance up, she found him looking at her with an expression she could not quite read. "This is Sienna Nash, Mrs. Talbot said, putting a hand on Sienna's shoulder with a grip that was just shy of painful. "She is an excellent seamstress and would be happy to help you with your project." The man's eyes flicked to Sienna's dress, taking in the patches and the frayed hem, and something shifted in his expression. "Can you sew?" he asked her directly, ignoring Mrs. Talbot entirely. Sienna hesitated, knowing she should lie, knowing Mrs. Talbot would punish her if she cost the boarding house whatever fee this man was willing to pay. But something in those blue-gray eyes made her want to tell the truth. "I can do basic mending," she said quietly, "but I have never worked with buckskin or leather." Mrs. Talbot's hand tightened painfully on her shoulder, but the man nodded as if this was the answer he had expected. "Can you learn?" he asked. "I can try," Sienna said, because that was all she had ever done, try and try and try to survive in a world that seemed determined to grind her down. The man studied her for a long moment, and then he turned to Mrs. Talbot. "I will pay her directly," he said. $2 a day, and I will provide meals." Mrs. Talbot's eyes lit up with greed. "Of course, but as her employer, I would expect a finder's fee of, I will pay her directly," the man repeated, and his voice had gone hard and flat, the kind of voice that said he was done negotiating. "She will come to my camp each day, and I will bring her back each evening. You will not take a cent of her wages." Mrs. Talbot's face flushed with anger, but even she was not foolish enough to argue with a man who looked like he could snap her in half without breaking a sweat. "Fine," she said through gritted teeth, "but she still owes me for her room and board." "How much?" the man asked, and when Mrs. Talbot named a sum that was 3 times what it should have been, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a leather pouch. He counted out coins and placed them on the table with a finality that made it clear the matter was settled. "That should cover the next 3 months," he said. "And if I find out you have been mistreating her or taking her wages, I will come back, and you will not like what happens." Mrs. Talbot's face went pale and she nodded mutely. The man turned to Sienna, and his expression softened slightly. "My name is Jonas Striker," he said. "Can you be ready to leave in 10 minutes?" Sienna's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst out of her chest. She had no idea what she was agreeing to, but she knew it had to be better than staying at the boarding house. "Yes, sir," she said, and then she turned and ran up the stairs to the attic to gather her few possessions. She had so little that it barely filled a small cloth bag. A change of underclothes, a comb with several teeth missing, a small wooden bird her father had carved for her when she was a child, and a tintype of her parents on their wedding day, the metal bent and scratched but still precious. She changed into her other dress, which was just as patched as the first, and then she hurried back downstairs. Jonas Striker was waiting for her outside, standing next to a horse that was as large and powerful as he was, a bay gelding with kind eyes and a white star on its forehead. He took her bag and tied it to the saddle, and then he turned to her with a question in his eyes. "Have you ever ridden?" he asked. "No, sir," Sienna admitted, feeling foolish and small next to him and his horse. "Do not call me sir," he said, and there was something almost gentle in his voice. "My name is Jonas." He held out his hand to her. "I am going to lift you up, and then I am going to climb up behind you. The ride is about an hour, and I need you to hold on to the saddle horn. Can you do that?" Sienna nodded, not trusting her voice, and then his hands were on her waist, lifting her as if she weighed nothing at all, and she was sitting on the horse, her legs dangling awkwardly to one side because she was wearing a dress. Jonas swung up behind her with an ease that spoke of long practice, and then his arms were around her, holding the reins, and she could feel the heat of his body against her back. The horse started to walk, and Sienna gripped the saddle horn with both hands, terrified she was going to fall. But Jonas's arms were steady around her, and after a few minutes, she began to relax slightly, enough to look around at the town passing by. They rode through the streets of Portland, past the shops and houses, and then out into the countryside, where the road became a track that led into the forest. The trees closed in around them, tall pines and firs that blocked out most of the sky, and the air smelled of resin and earth, and something wild and clean that Sienna had never smelled before. She had been born in Portland and had never been more than a few miles from the town, and the forest felt both frightening and magical, as if she had stepped into a world that existed outside of time. Jonas did not speak, and Sienna did not dare to break the silence, so they rode through the forest with only the sound of the horses' hooves on the soft ground and the occasional call of a bird. After what felt like both an eternity and no time at all, Jonas guided the horse off the track and through the trees, and then they emerged into a clearing. Sienna caught her breath. In the center of the clearing was a cabin, solidly built from logs chinked with mud, with a stone chimney and real glass windows that glinted in the autumn sunlight. There was a small barn to one side and a corral where two more horses watched them with interest, and beyond the cabin, the ground sloped down to a creek that sparkled as it tumbled over rocks. It was the most beautiful place Sienna had ever seen, and for a moment, she forgot to be frightened. Jonas dismounted and then reached up to lift her down, his hands careful on her waist. "This is where I live," he said unnecessarily. "I trap and hunt in the winter, and I trade the furs in Portland. In the summer, I guide hunting parties into the mountains. I built this cabin 5 years ago when I decided I was tired of living in the high country year-round." Sienna looked around, trying to take it all in. "It is beautiful," she said softly. Jonas looked at her with an expression she could not read, and then he turned and led the horse to the barn. "Come inside," he said over his shoulder. "I will show you what needs to be done." Sienna followed him, her legs unsteady from the ride, and stepped through the door of the cabin into a single large room that was surprisingly clean and orderly. There was a fireplace with a good fire already burning, a table and chairs, a bed in one corner covered with furs, and shelves lined with supplies and tools. On the table was a pile of animal hides, some of them scraped clean and others still needing work, and next to them was a basket full of needles and sinew thread. "I need shirts and trousers," Jonas said, moving to the table and picking up one of the hides. "And I need repairs done on my winter gear. I can show you how to work the leather, and if you can learn, I will pay you what I promised." He paused and looked at her directly. "But I will not force you to stay. If you want to go back to Portland after today, I will take you, and you will still be paid for your time." Sienna swallowed hard. "Why did you pay Mrs. Talbot for 3 months if you do not know if I can do the work?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Jonas set down the hide and crossed his arms over his broad chest. "Because I saw your dress," he said bluntly. "And I saw the marks on your hands, and I saw the way she grabbed you, and I thought that even if you cannot sew, you deserve to be somewhere better than that boarding house." Sienna felt tears prick at her eyes, and she blinked them back fiercely because she had learned long ago that crying did not help. "Thank you," she whispered. Jonas nodded once, and then he pulled out a chair from the table. "Sit," he said. I will make you something to eat, and then we will start." Sienna sat, her legs trembling, and watched as Jonas moved around the cabin with surprising grace for such a large man. He ladled stew from a pot that hung over the fire into a wooden bowl and set it in front of her with a hunk of bread and a cup of water. The stew was rich and thick, full of meat and vegetables, and Sienna ate it slowly, trying to make it last, trying not to think about how long it had been since she had eaten something this good. Jonas ate his own meal standing up, leaning against the counter, and when Sienna had finished, he took her bowl and washed it in a bucket of water near the door. Then he came back to the table and picked up one of the hides. "This is elk," he said. "The hide is soft and pliable, good for clothing. The first step is to cut the pattern." He laid the hide flat on the table and used a piece of charcoal to mark lines on the surface, his movements confident and sure. "I need you to watch closely," he said, "and then I need you to try." Sienna watched as he cut the hide with a knife that looked sharp enough to split a hair, and then he handed the knife to her. "Your turn," he said, pushing another hide toward her. Sienna's hands shook as she took the knife, terrified she was going to ruin the hide and waste his resources. But Jonas stood behind her, his hands covering hers, guiding the knife along the lines he had drawn. "Steady," he said, his voice low and calm. "Do not rush. The hide is forgiving if you are patient." His hands were warm and calloused, and Sienna could feel the strength in them. But he was gentle, his touch careful as he showed her how to cut. They worked together until the pattern was complete, and then he showed her how to punch holes along the edges with an awl and thread the sinew through to join the pieces. The work was hard and her fingers ached, but it was different from the endless scrubbing and washing she had done at the boarding house. This was creating something, making something useful and necessary, and there was a satisfaction in it that surprised her. Jonas was patient, never raising his voice even when she made a mistake, simply showing her how to fix it and move on. The hours passed quickly, and Sienna was startled when Jonas suddenly straightened and looked out the window. "It is getting dark," he said. "I need to take you back." Sienna looked down at the shirt they had been working on, the pieces starting to come together into something recognizable. "I can stay longer," she said quickly. "I do not mind working after dark." Jonas shook his head. "You need to rest," he said firmly. "And I need to keep my word to bring you back each evening, or Mrs. Talbot will cause trouble." He paused and then added, "Tomorrow, if you want to come back, I will be here at dawn to collect you." Sienna stood, her body stiff from sitting for so long, and nodded. "I want to come back," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. Jonas smiled, a slow smile that transformed his face from stern to something warmer, and Sienna felt her heart skip a beat. "Good," he said. "Now let us go before it gets too dark to see the trail." The ride back to Portland was quieter than the ride out had been, the forest full of shadows and the sound of night creatures beginning to stir. Sienna was more comfortable on the horse now, her body relaxing against Jonas's chest, and she found herself wishing the ride could last longer, that she did not have to go back to the cold attic and Mrs. Talbot's sharp voice. Jonas left her at the boarding house door, handing her $2 silver that he pressed into her palm with a firmness that said he expected her to keep them. "Hide those," he said quietly, "and I will see you tomorrow." Sienna nodded and slipped the coins into her pocket, and then she hurried inside before Mrs. Talbot could come out and make a scene. She climbed the stairs to the attic and sat on her narrow bed, holding the coins in her hand and marveling at them. $2 for one day's work. It was more money than she had ever had at one time, and she felt a surge of hope so strong it was almost painful. The next morning, Jonas was waiting for her before the sun had fully risen, his horse stamping impatiently in the cold air. Sienna climbed up in front of him with more confidence than she had the day before, and they rode out to the cabin in companionable silence. This time, when they arrived, Jonas had already prepared breakfast, and they ate together at the table before starting work. The days fell into a pattern. Jonas would collect Sienna each morning and bring her to the cabin, where they would work on the hides together. He taught her how to cut and sew, how to soften leather with oil, and how to make it waterproof with beeswax. He taught her about the different animals, how elk hide was different from deer hide, how bear hide was thick and heavy and required a different kind of needle. Sienna learned quickly, her fingers growing nimble and sure, and she took pride in the work she produced. Jonas never praised her directly, but she could see the approval in his eyes when she finished a piece well, and that was enough. More than enough. As the weeks passed, Sienna began to notice other things about Jonas. The way he moved with a quiet efficiency that spoke of years living alone. The way he always made sure she had enough to eat, even if it meant he went with a smaller portion. The way he watched the forest with a constant awareness, as if he was always listening for danger. And the way he sometimes looked at her when he thought she was not paying attention, his expression soft and wondering, as if he could not quite believe she was real. Sienna found herself looking forward to each morning, to the ride through the forest, and the hours spent working beside Jonas in the warm cabin. She learned about his life in bits and pieces, the stories he told as they worked. He had been born in Pennsylvania, the son of a blacksmith, and had come west when he was 18 to make his fortune in the goldfields. He had not found gold, but he had found something better. The mountains and the forests and the wild places where a man could live on his own terms. "I have never wanted to be tied down," he said one afternoon as they worked on a pair of trousers. "Never wanted to answer to a boss or live in a town where everyone knows your business. I like the silence and the space." Sienna nodded, understanding more than he probably realized. She had never had the luxury of choosing her own life, but if she could, she thought she would choose something like this. A place away from prying eyes and judgment, where the only things that mattered were the work you did and the life you built. Winter arrived with a vengeance, bringing snow that blanketed the forest and turned the world into a study in black and white. Jonas began to talk about the trapping season, about the lines he would run through the mountains and the furs he would bring back. Sienna listened, trying not to think about what would happen when winter was over and he no longer needed her to sew. One particularly cold morning in December, Jonas arrived at the boarding house with an extra fur wrapped around his shoulders. "Put this on," he said, draping it around Sienna before she could protest. "You are shivering, and I will not have you catching your death." The fur was warm and heavy, and it smelled like Jonas, like leather and pine smoke and something indefinably masculine. Sienna pulled it close around her shoulders and climbed onto the horse, and when Jonas's arms came around her to hold the reins, she let herself lean back against him just a little, seeking his warmth. She felt him tense for a moment, and then he relaxed, and one of his hands shifted slightly, so his arm was more firmly around her waist. Neither of them spoke, but something had changed. Some invisible line had been crossed, and Sienna's heart was beating so hard she was sure he could feel it. When they reached the cabin, Jonas helped her down from the horse and then stood there for a moment, his hand still on her waist, looking down at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Sienna," he said, and then stopped, as if he did not know what to say next. "Yes," she whispered. He opened his mouth, then closed it again and stepped back. "We should get inside," he said gruffly. "It is too cold to stand out here." Inside the cabin, the fire was burning low, and Jonas built it up while Sienna shed the fur and moved to the table where yesterday's work was waiting. But she could not concentrate, could not stop thinking about the way Jonas had looked at her, the way his hands had lingered on her waist. They worked in silence for an hour, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife, and then Jonas suddenly stood and walked to the window, staring out at the snow-covered clearing. "I need to tell you something," he said, his back to her. Sienna set down the needle she was holding, her heart in her throat. "What is it?" Jonas turned to face her, and she could see the struggle in his expression, the way he was fighting with himself. "I did not bring you here just because I needed someone to sew," he said finally. "I brought you here because I could not stand to see you in that place, being treated like you were worth nothing. And I thought that if I could give you work, give you a way to earn money, you could save enough to leave Portland to go somewhere better." Sienna stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. "I do not understand," she said. Jonas ran a hand through his hair, making it stand on end. "I am not good with words," he said. "I have spent most of my life alone, and I have never wanted it any other way. But then I saw you in that kitchen, wearing that damned dress with all those patches, and something happened. Something changed." He paused, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "I have been trying to ignore it, trying to tell myself it would pass, but it has not passed. It has only gotten stronger." Sienna's pulse was racing now, hope and fear warring inside her. "What has gotten stronger?" she asked, even though she thought she knew, even though she was afraid to hear the answer. Jonas crossed the room in 3 long strides and dropped to one knee in front of her chair, taking her hands in his. His hands were rough and scarred, but they held hers with a gentleness that made tears spring to her eyes. "I have fallen in love with you," he said, the words rough and raw. "I know I have no right. I know you are young and deserve better than a mountain man who lives alone in the woods, but I cannot keep it to myself any longer. I love you, Sienna Nash, and if you will have me, I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to wear a patched dress again." Sienna felt the tears spill over, running down her cheeks, and she tightened her grip on his hands. "I love you too," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "I have loved you for weeks now, but I did not think you could ever feel the same way about someone like me." Jonas made a sound that was half laugh, half groan, and then he was pulling her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "Someone like you," he repeated against her hair. "You are the strongest, bravest person I have ever met. You have survived things that would have broken most people, and you did it with grace and dignity. How could I not love you?" Sienna buried her face against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek, and let herself cry for the first time in years. She cried for everything she had lost, for all the years of loneliness and hunger and fear, and for the overwhelming relief of finally being somewhere safe. Jonas held her through it all, one hand stroking her hair, murmuring words she could not quite hear, but that soothed her nonetheless. When the tears finally subsided, she pulled back slightly to look up at him, and he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, tentative and sweet, and Sienna felt something inside her that had been locked tight for years finally open. She kissed him back, her hands coming up to grip his shirt, and Jonas made a low sound in his throat and deepened the kiss, pulling her closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jonas rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. "I know it is fast, but I do not want to wait. I want you here with me where you belong." Sienna's heart felt like it was going to burst. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." Jonas kissed her again, and this time there was nothing tentative about it. His hands were in her hair, and Sienna's were around his neck, and they kissed like people who had been starving and had finally found sustenance. When they broke apart this time, Jonas was grinning, a wide, joyful grin that made him look years younger. "We will go to Portland tomorrow and find a preacher," he said. "And then we will come back here, and you will never have to go back to that boarding house again." Sienna nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat, and Jonas pulled her to her feet and spun her around, making her laugh despite the tears still on her cheeks. He set her down and kissed her once more, and then he stepped back, his expression becoming serious. "There is one more thing," he said. "I want to make you a dress, a proper dress without a single patch. I want you to wear it when we get married." Sienna blinked at him in confusion. "You want to make me a dress?" she repeated. Jonas nodded, looking almost shy. "I know how to sew," he said. "You have been learning from me, after all, and I have some fabric I got in trade last year. It is nothing fancy, but it is good sturdy wool, and I can make you something that will keep you warm and look beautiful." Sienna felt fresh tears spring to her eyes. "You would do that for me?" she whispered. "I would do anything for you," Jonas said simply, and she believed him. That night, Jonas took Sienna back to the boarding house, but not before he kissed her thoroughly at the door and promised to return at dawn. Sienna floated up to the attic, her heart so full she thought it might overflow, and she lay on her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, marveling at how much her life had changed in the span of a few short weeks. The next morning, Jonas arrived even earlier than usual, and they rode into Portland together. They found a preacher at the small church on the edge of town, a kind-faced man who agreed to marry them the following week. Jonas paid him in advance, and then they went to the general store where Jonas bought supplies and Sienna wandered the aisles, looking at all the things she had never been able to afford. Jonas found her standing in front of a display of ribbons, her fingers hovering over a length of blue satin. "Do you like that one?" he asked, and when she nodded shyly, he bought it without hesitation, along with a bar of lavender soap and a tortoiseshell comb that made Sienna gasp when she saw the price. "Jonas, it is too much," she protested. But he just shook his head and paid the clerk, adding the items to his pack with a satisfaction that said he had no intention of arguing about it. They stopped by the boarding house only long enough for Sienna to collect her few belongings, ignoring Mrs. Talbot's demands for an explanation and her shrill warnings that Sienna was making a terrible mistake. Jonas put Sienna's bag on the horse and lifted her up, and they rode away without looking back. At the cabin, Jonas set Sienna's bag inside the door and then turned to her with a determined expression. "I need you to stand still," he said. "I need to take measurements so I can make your dress." Sienna stood obediently while Jonas used a length of string to measure her, his touch professional but still making her shiver. He wrote down the measurements on a scrap of paper and then went to a trunk in the corner, pulling out a length of deep green wool that made Sienna's breath catch. "This was going to be a coat for me," Jonas said, "but I want you to have it instead. Green is a good color on you. It will bring out your eyes." Sienna had never thought about whether colors suited her or not. She had always just worn whatever was available, whatever someone else had discarded. But as Jonas held the fabric up to her shoulders, she could see what he meant. The green did something to her hazel eyes, making them look more green than brown, and against the wool, her skin looked less sallow and tired. For the next week, Jonas worked on the dress in every spare moment. He cut the fabric with the same precision he used on the leather, his large hands surprisingly deft as he stitched the seams. Sienna tried to help, but he shooed her away, saying he wanted it to be a surprise. Sienna watched him work, marveling at the way his fingers moved, and felt a surge of love so strong it almost hurt. This man, this strong, capable mountain man, was sewing her a dress with his own hands because he wanted her to have something beautiful to wear on their wedding day. It was the most romantic thing she could imagine. The week passed in a blur of activity. Jonas continued to run his trap lines, but now he took Sienna with him, teaching her the ways of the forest. She learned to read tracks and identify plants, to move quietly through the trees and to appreciate the vast silence of the wilderness. At night, they sat by the fire and talked about their future, about the life they would build together. "I want children," Jonas said one evening, his arm around Sienna's shoulders as they sat on the bench in front of the cabin, watching the stars come out. "I want a whole houseful of them, running wild and free." Sienna leaned her head against his shoulder, imagining it. Children with Jonas's blue-gray eyes and her dark hair, children who would grow up knowing they were loved and wanted. "I want that too," she said softly. Jonas kissed the top of her head. "We will have a good life," he said. "I promise you that." The night before the wedding, Jonas finished the dress. He held it up for Sienna to see, and she gasped. It was beautiful, far more beautiful than anything she had ever owned. The green wool had been cut and sewn into a simple but elegant design, with a fitted bodice and a full skirt that would swirl when she walked. The sleeves were long and fitted, and Jonas had added tiny covered buttons down the front that he had carved himself from wood. "Try it on," he urged, and Sienna took the dress with trembling hands and went behind the screen in the corner to change. The dress fit perfectly, hugging her waist and shoulders before falling in graceful folds to the floor. Sienna smoothed the fabric with her hands, marveling at how soft it was, how clean and new. She had never worn anything without patches, had never had something that was made just for her, and she felt tears pricking at her eyes again. She stepped out from behind the screen, and Jonas turned to look at her. His expression went very still, and then he crossed the room in 2 strides and cupped her face in his hands. "You are the most beautiful woman I have ever seen," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Sienna laughed, a shaky sound. "I am just me," she said. "Exactly," Jonas said, and kissed her. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of bright winter day that made everything sparkle. Jonas and Sienna rode into Portland together. Sienna wearing her new dress with the blue ribbon threaded through her hair, and Jonas in his best buckskin shirt and clean trousers. They met the preacher at the church, and he married them in a simple ceremony with the church caretaker and his wife as witnesses. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Jonas kissed Sienna with a tenderness that made her heart ache, and then he led her outside to where his horse was waiting. He had tied white ribbons to the bridle, and the horse tossed its head, making the ribbons flutter in the breeze. "I wanted to make today special," Jonas said, and Sienna could see the vulnerability in his eyes, the fear that he had not done enough. "It is perfect," she said, standing on her toes to kiss him. "Everything is perfect." They rode back to the cabin together, man and wife, and when Jonas lifted Sienna down from the horse, he did not set her on her feet. Instead, he carried her across the threshold, her new dress billowing around them, and set her down gently in the center of the room. "Welcome home, Mrs. Striker," he said, and Sienna felt a joy so pure and complete that she thought she might burst from it. That night, as they lay in bed with the fire crackling in the hearth and the snow falling softly outside, Jonas held Sienna close and whispered promises against her skin. Promises of love and protection and a lifetime of happiness. And Sienna, who had never dared to dream of such things, let herself believe in them. The winter passed in a haze of contentment. Sienna learned to be a mountain man's wife, learned to cook over an open fire and to preserve meat and vegetables for the lean months. She learned to shoot a rifle and to help Jonas with the trap lines, and she discovered that she loved the wild, untamed beauty of the forest. Jonas was a patient teacher and a devoted husband, and Sienna marveled every day at how different her life was now. She had enough to eat, warm clothes to wear, and a man who looked at her like she was precious beyond measure. At night, they would lie together in the big bed, and Jonas would run his fingers through her hair and tell her stories about the places he had been and the things he had seen. And Sienna would listen and feel safe in a way she had never felt before. Spring came slowly to the mountains, the snow melting in fits and starts, and with it came new life. The forest was full of bird song and the scent of growing things, and Sienna discovered that she was pregnant. She told Jonas one evening as they sat on the bench outside the cabin, watching the sun set behind the mountains. He stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and then he pulled her into his arms and held her so tightly she could barely breathe. "A baby," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "We are going to have a baby." Sienna nodded against his chest, her own eyes wet with tears. "Are you happy?" she asked, suddenly uncertain. Jonas pulled back to look at her, his eyes fierce. "Happy," he repeated. "Sienna, I am the happiest man alive. You have given me everything I never knew I wanted." The months that followed were busy ones. Jonas started building an addition to the cabin, a second room where the baby could sleep, and Sienna sewed tiny clothes from scraps of fabric, marveling at how small they were. Her body changed and grew, and Jonas treated her like she was made of glass, constantly worrying that she was doing too much or working too hard. "I am not fragile," Sienna told him one afternoon as he tried to stop her from carrying a bucket of water. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time." "Not my woman," Jonas said stubbornly. "Not my baby. I will not take any chances." Sienna sighed but let him carry the bucket because she knew it made him feel better. And truthfully, she loved being fussed over, loved the way Jonas would rest his hand on her growing belly and talk to the baby, telling it about the mountains and the animals and the life they would have together. In late autumn, when the leaves were turning gold and red, Sienna went into labor. Jonas, who had faced down bears and mountain lions without flinching, went pale and panicked, and Sienna had to talk him through riding to town to fetch the midwife. The labor was long and hard, but when the midwife finally placed a squalling, red-faced baby in Sienna's arms, all the pain was forgotten. "It is a boy," the midwife said with a smile, and Sienna looked down at her son with a wonder that stole her breath. Jonas, who had been pacing outside the cabin for the last hour, burst through the door at the midwife's call. He crossed the room in 3 strides and knelt beside the bed, staring at the baby with an expression of awe. "He is so small," he whispered. "He is perfect," Sienna said, and Jonas nodded, reaching out a tentative finger to touch the baby's tiny hand. The baby's fingers curled around Jonas's, and Jonas made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "What should we name him?" Jonas asked, looking at Sienna. Sienna had been thinking about this for months. "Thomas," she said. "After my father." Jonas nodded, his eyes wet with tears. "Thomas Striker," he said, testing the name. "I like it." The midwife stayed for 3 days, making sure Sienna and the baby were both healthy, and then Jonas took her back to Portland with a bag of furs as payment. When he returned, he found Sienna sitting in the rocking chair he had made, nursing Thomas and singing softly. Jonas stood in the doorway, watching them, and Sienna looked up and smiled at him. "Welcome home," she said, and Jonas felt his heart clench with love. The years that followed were full and rich. Thomas grew from a tiny infant into a sturdy toddler with his father's blue-gray eyes and his mother's dark hair. He was followed 2 years later by a daughter, whom they named Catherine, and then 3 years after that by another son, James. The cabin grew along with the family, with Jonas adding rooms and a proper second floor. Sienna tended a large garden and kept chickens and a milk cow, and Jonas continued to trap and guide hunting parties, providing well for his growing family. Sienna never forgot the years of poverty and hunger, and she made sure her children knew the value of hard work and gratitude. But she also made sure they knew they were loved, that they were wanted, that they would never have to wear clothes with patches or go to bed hungry. And every year on their anniversary, Jonas would present Sienna with a new dress that he had sewn himself. It became a tradition, a reminder of the day he had promised to make sure she never wore patches again, and Sienna treasured each one, hanging them in the wardrobe with care. One evening, when Thomas was 10 and Catherine was 8 and James was 5, the family sat around the fire after dinner, the children begging their parents for stories. Jonas told them about the time he had tracked a cougar through 3 feet of snow, and Sienna told them about the year she had canned 50 jars of apple sauce. "Tell us how you met," Catherine said, leaning against her mother's knee. "Tell us the story again." Sienna looked at Jonas, and he smiled at her, that slow smile that still made her heart skip a beat after all these years. "Your father rescued me," Sienna said. "I was working in a terrible place, and I had nothing but patched dresses and rough hands. And your father saw me and decided to give me a chance. I fell in love with her the moment I saw her," Jonas added, reaching over to take Sienna's hand. "I just did not know it yet. And Mama fell in love with Papa because he made her a dress," Thomas said, having heard the story many times. "I fell in love with your father because he was kind," Sienna corrected gently. "The dress was just a symbol of that kindness. He saw that I needed something beautiful, something that was just for me, and he made it happen." Catherine sighed happily. "I want someone to make me a dress someday," she said. "You will have to find a man who knows how to sew," James said practically, making everyone laugh. Later, after the children had been tucked into bed, Jonas and Sienna sat on the bench outside the cabin, watching the stars come out. It was a clear night, and the Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of light. "Do you ever regret it?" Jonas asked quietly. "Marrying me, living out here away from everything?" Sienna turned to look at him, surprised. "Never," she said firmly. "This is the life I always wanted but never thought I could have. You gave me that, Jonas. You gave me everything." Jonas pulled her close, tucking her head under his chin. "You gave me more," he said. "You gave me a family. You gave me a home. Before you, I was just existing, just moving through the days. But now, I am living." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of the forest and the occasional murmur from inside the cabin as one of the children talked in their sleep. Sienna thought about the girl she had been, wearing patched dresses and scrubbing laundry with raw hands, and marveled at the woman she had become. She had never owned a dress without patches until Jonas had sewn her one, and she had worn it at their wedding. And in doing so, she had stepped into a new life, a life full of love and laughter and belonging. "I love you," she said softly, and Jonas tightened his arms around her. "I love you too," he said, "always and forever." The years continued to pass, and the Striker family grew and thrived. Thomas grew into a young man who inherited his father's love of the mountains and his mother's practicality. Catherine became a skilled seamstress, learning from both her parents, and James proved to have a gift for working with horses. Jonas and Sienna grew older together, their hair turning gray and their faces gaining lines, but their love never diminished. If anything, it grew stronger, deepened by years of shared experiences and the bonds of the family they had built together. When Jonas was 55 and Sienna was 47, they became grandparents for the first time when Thomas married a girl from Portland and brought her home with a baby on the way. The cabin, which had seemed so spacious when Jonas first built it, was now bursting at the seams with children and grandchildren, and Jonas built yet another addition to accommodate everyone. Sienna loved being a grandmother, loved holding the tiny babies and telling them stories about their grandfather and the day he had sewn her a dress. And Jonas loved watching Sienna with the grandchildren, loved seeing the joy in her eyes, and knowing that he had been part of creating this legacy. One autumn evening, when they were both in their 60s and the grandchildren had gone home with their parents, Jonas and Sienna sat on their bench, wrapped in quilts against the chill. The forest was quiet, the leaves falling softly around them, and Jonas reached over to take Sienna's hand. "Do you remember the day we met?" he asked. Sienna smiled. "How could I forget? You walked into that kitchen like you owned the world, and you stood up to Mrs. Talbot for me. No one had ever done that before." Jonas chuckled. "I took one look at you in that patched dress and knew I had to get you out of there. I told myself it was just kindness, just wanting to help someone in need. But the truth is, I was already falling in love with you. And I was terrified of you," Sienna admitted. "You were so big and fierce looking. But then you were gentle and patient, and you made me feel like I mattered, like I was worth something." "You were always worth something," Jonas said fiercely. "You were always worth everything." They sat in silence for a while, holding hands and watching the stars come out. Finally, Sienna said, "Thank you, Jonas, for the dress, for the life, for all of it. I never thought I would be this happy." Jonas lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it. "The pleasure has been all mine, Mrs. Striker," he said. "You made me a better man. You gave me a reason to live instead of just surviving. And I will spend every day I have left thanking God for the moment I walked into that kitchen and saw you." Sienna felt tears on her cheeks, but they were happy tears, the kind that came from a heart so full it had to overflow. She leaned against Jonas, and he wrapped his arm around her, and they sat together under the stars. Two people who had found each other against all odds and built a life that was richer and more beautiful than either of them had ever imagined. The dress Jonas had sewn for their wedding still hung in the wardrobe, carefully preserved and wrapped in cloth. Sienna had shown it to her daughters and granddaughters, telling them the story of how a mountain man had loved her enough to sew her something beautiful with his own hands. And they had marveled at it, at the tiny careful stitches and the love that had gone into every seam. "Keep it safe," Sienna had told them. "It is more than just a dress. It is a reminder that love can come from unexpected places, and that the best things in life are often the ones we never dared to dream of." And so the dress was passed down through the generations, a tangible reminder of the love between Jonas and Sienna Striker, and of the day a mountain man had seen a girl in patched dresses and decided to change both their lives forever. It was a symbol of hope and kindness and the transformative power of love, and it remained in the family for generations to come. A treasured heirloom that told a story of two people who had found each other in the Wild West and built a life together that was full of joy and laughter and unshakable love. Jonas and Sienna lived many more years together, their love a constant in a changing world. They saw their children grow and have children of their own, and they watched as the wild frontier they had known slowly gave way to civilization. But through it all they had each other, and the cabin in the clearing, and the memories of a life well lived. When Jonas passed away at the age of 78, peacefully in his sleep, Sienna mourned him deeply, but took comfort in knowing that they had had so many good years together. She continued to live in the cabin, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, and she would often sit on the bench outside and talk to Jonas as if he were still there beside her. "We did well, did we not?" she would say to the wind. "We built something beautiful." And in her heart, she knew that he agreed. Sienna lived to be 82, sharp and spry until the very end. On the day she died, surrounded by 3 generations of her family, she was wearing the green dress Jonas had made her so many years ago. It still fit, though it had been altered slightly over the years, and she had insisted on putting it on that morning as if she knew what was coming. "I want to be buried in this dress," she told her children. "It is how I want Jonas to see me when we meet again." And so Sienna Nash Striker was laid to rest beside her husband, wearing the dress that had started it all, the dress that symbolized a love that had transcended hardship and time. The family gathered around the graves and told stories about Jonas and Sienna, about their love and their laughter, and the legacy they had left behind. And in the cabin that Jonas had built with his own hands, the rocking chair still sat by the fire, and the workbench where he had sewn Sienna's dress still stood in the corner. The family kept the cabin maintained, turning it into a place where all the Strikers could come to remember their roots and the two people who had started it all. Years later, when a great-great-granddaughter was married, she asked if she could wear Sienna's green dress on her wedding day. The family agreed, and the dress was carefully cleaned and altered to fit. And when the young woman walked down the aisle in that dress, she felt a connection to her ancestors that was almost tangible, as if Jonas and Sienna were there with her, blessing her union and wishing her the same kind of love they had shared. The story of Jonas and Sienna Striker became a family legend, told and retold to each new generation. It was a story of how a mountain man had seen a girl in need and decided to help, not knowing that in doing so, he would find the love of his life. It was a story of how a simple act of kindness, the sewing of a dress, had changed two lives forever. And it was a story that reminded everyone who heard it that love could be found in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the best things in life came from taking a chance on someone, from seeing past the patched dresses and rough hands to the person underneath. Jonas Striker had been a man of few words but many actions, a man who showed his love through the things he did rather than the things he said. And Sienna Nash Striker had been a woman of great strength and grace, who had survived poverty and hardship and had still managed to love with her whole heart. Together, they had built a life that was full of beauty and meaning, and they had left a legacy that endured long after they were gone. The dress, carefully preserved and treasured, remained a symbol of that love, a reminder that sometimes the most romantic gesture was also the most practical, and that true love was about seeing someone for who they really were and loving them all the more for it. Jonas had seen Sienna not as a poor girl in patched dresses, but as a woman of worth and value, and he had shown her that through the simple act of sewing her something beautiful. And Sienna had seen Jonas not as a rough mountain man who lived alone in the woods, but as a kind and gentle soul who needed someone to love, and she had given him that love freely and completely. Their story was one that inspired generations, a testament to the power of love to transform lives and create something lasting and beautiful. And every time a Striker daughter or granddaughter tried on that green dress, they felt a connection to that love, to the two people who had started it all, and they were reminded that they came from a long line of people who knew how to love deeply and well. The cabin in the clearing still stood, a monument to Jonas and Sienna's life together, and it remained a place where the family gathered to celebrate and remember. And on quiet evenings, when the wind moved through the pines and the stars came out overhead, it was easy to imagine that Jonas and Sienna were still there, sitting on their bench, holding hands and watching the sky, their love as eternal and unchanging as the mountains themselves. This was their story, the story of how a mountain man had sewn a dress for the woman he loved, and how that woman had worn it at their wedding, beginning a life together that was richer and more beautiful than either of them had ever dared to dream. It was a love story for the ages, set against the backdrop of the Wild West, and it remained a cherished part of the Striker family history, passed down through the years as a reminder that true love endured, that kindness mattered, and that sometimes the most profound acts of love were also the simplest. And so the legacy of Jonas and Sienna Striker lived on, in the dress that hung in the wardrobe, in the cabin that stood in the clearing, in the stories told around the fire, and most of all in the hearts of all those who came after them, who carried their blood and their spirit and their capacity for deep, abiding, transformative love. They had never owned much in terms of material wealth, but they had owned something far more valuable. They had owned a love that was true and lasting, a love that had created a family and a legacy that would endure for generations to come. That was the real gift Jonas had given Sienna on their wedding day, not just a dress without patches, but a life without fear, a home without hunger, and a love without end. And that was the gift Sienna had given Jonas in return: a reason to live, a family to cherish, and a love that made every day worthwhile. Together, they had created something beautiful and lasting, and their story remained a beacon of hope and inspiration for all who heard it, a reminder that love could conquer all, that kindness mattered, and that sometimes the most unlikely people could find each other and build a life that was nothing short of miraculous. The end of their mortal story was just the beginning of their legend, and Jonas and Sienna Striker lived on in the hearts and memories of all those who came after them, forever young, forever in love, forever sitting on that bench under the stars, holding hands and dreaming of the future they had built together, one stitch, one day, one act of love at a time.